the rabbinic commentators couldn't help but to try to understand the moral dimension offered by the story. What sin merited the punishment that each nation would have its own language? Was it the hubris of building a tower too high, or seeking to make a name for this nation rather than heralding God's name? Or was it urbanization rather than spreading out upon the earth, more akin to our Hebrew ancestors? Some of the rabbinic commentators focus on where it says at the beginning following that in chapter 11, verse 1, which we began our Torah reading with today, Vayihi chol haaretz va'achad udvarim achadim. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. How could it be that everyone had the same language and the same words? We have all these different nations. That's suspicious and should cause a clue. What would be wrong with that anyway? What's wrong with sharing a language? What's wrong with working together? So some of the commentators suggest that the sin was not sharing a language, but sharing the same thoughts. To build the tower, the builders imposed a conformity of thought, a single way of thinking in the world, and any worker bee who voiced difference would be thrown from the towers to their deaths, as the Midrash imagines. The punishment of being broken up into different languages so that people couldn't understand each other was a punishment for totalitarianism and a gift of pluralism and diversity. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs explains, the sin of the Tower of Babel was the first totalitarianism. It is a supreme act of hubris committed time and again in history. He wrote, it's an attempt to impose an artificial unity onto divinely created diversity. So each year, as I read through this chapter, I generally read it with this in mind. The punishment into different languages wasn't a punishment at all, it was a blessing. It was a blessing of the diversity of thought. But this year, I found myself stuck on the Peshat, meaning the plain sense, not on the Midrash. I read Genesis 11:7. It's a very short story, like Cain and Esav. Hava nerda v'navla sham sfatam asher lo yishma'u ish safat re'ehu. Let us then, God says, go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech, each person to their re'ehu, to his fellow human being. The plain sense is that it's clearly a punishment, not a blessing. So that they shall not understand one another's speech, so that they will not form a more perfect union. With scant days, if not all the more so, we need to be able to build something together. These are projects. We need to be able to work together on our national and global issues, and our inability to work on these projects because we can't even engage in initial conversations, we are failing to speak any common language, certainly feels more like a curse than a blessing. As Rashi notes on this verse, not very subtly, when it says they will not understand one another, that means one asks for one thing and the other doesn't understand him and therefore attacks him and splits open his brains. Nice Rashi, nice subtle Rashi. Or as the 13th century Chizkuni says, so that they will not understand one another's language, that means they will forget any tongue other than the one they are in the habit of using. We in this country have grown so used to the tongue that we are in the habit of using that seems beyond listening to the other side or the other sides. We can no longer use the language that we previously could understand. This year, I was introduced to an American thinker, maybe even a prophet, who to me foretold some of the situation we find ourselves in. It's a public figure I'd never heard of, and a controversial figure who in his time and following was marginalized from history. He's the civil rights hero, Bayard Rustin. I didn't ever hear about him until I read Coleman Hughes' essay last year. Rustin was born, I should take a show of hands, but then I'll just be embarrassed that you all know him and I didn't. There was a movie on Netflix, thank you, which I did not see. And there's some controversial issues about the movie of misrepresenting his thought, because his thought is, as you will hear in a moment, can make us uncomfortable in our present day. Rustin was born in 1912 and died in 1987. He was a key ally of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Writing in 1965, he was crucial in the work that led up to the desegregation and to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which he praised. But right after them in 1965, he prophetically warned that further gains would be undermined by a reaction within the Black community against further integration. He warned that in response to the magnitude of the obstacles still to go to get to freedom that most Black people still faced, nevertheless, it would be tempting for the movement to adopt a no-win tactic consisting of the demand that the hypocrisy of white liberals must be exposed. He wrote, "The spokesmen for this view are often described as radicals, but I do not describe them as radicals. What they really are is the movement's moralists. They seek to change hearts, white hearts, without any plan of tangible institutional reform." He supported very much the creation of Black studies departments, but as they evolved, he then wrote that their true purpose must be to use the best historical methods to create a common narrative for America, one that corrected the corrupt and one-sided narrative taught in schools of American history. But he warned that what would likely happen is that the departments would produce instead an alternative narrative, one whose purpose was to politically motivate Black people by developing their own language and worldview. In a 1969 essay, Rustin warned that this focus on the psychological aspects of the racial problem would cause a neglect of its economic dimensions, that a focus on identity, Black pride, and white guilt would undermine the idea of an interracial brotherhood that would lead to social change. So I learned a little bit more about him. He was a courageous activist, an organizer, a writer. He was a descendant of slaves who had been arrested and beaten for refusing to sit at the back of a Jim Crow bus in 1942 when he was 30 years old, a full 13 years before Rosa Parks made history by doing the same. This is relative. He's a Quaker and a conscientious objector. It was Rustin who introduced Martin Luther King to Gandhi's theory of nonviolent resistance and persuaded King, his close friend and confidant, to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, though Rustin omitted the word Christian in his original plan. 6 years later, Rustin organized the landmark March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Rustin had put it together in a matter of months and created the blueprint for the modern American mass political rally. So why was he erased from civil rights history? This is according to Coleman Hughes' reason. The short answer is that Rustin lived as an openly gay man at a time when every state in the US outlawed homosexuality and people had to live in a closeted fashion, which he refused to do. His civil rights colleagues could imagine the end of a legalized white supremacy, but could not envision a world in which Rustin could live as a gay man without fear of arrest. His rejection of the closet, which makes him a heroic figure, I hope, in our own day, cost him dearly in his. In 1953, he was arrested for being gay publicly, and he served time in jail. In 1960, Adam Clayton Powell, the congressman who represented Harlem, out of professional jealousy, blackmailed Martin Luther King Jr. into canceling a planned protest at the Democratic National Convention by threatening to go public with a false story that King and Rustin were engaged in a homosexual, that's their word back then, and a gay affair. Shortly after, Rustin stepped away from his public association with King so that critics could never use his sexuality as ammunition against King or against the civil rights movement. After King gave his galvanizing speech in the 1963 March on Washington, Rustin read a list of the movement's demands there, pausing after each one so that the crowd of 250,000 people could cheer. He demanded that Congress pass effective civil rights legislation with, in his words, no compromise, no filibuster, and that it include public accommodations, decent housing, integrated education, and the right to vote. He demanded that segregation be ended in every school district in the year 1963, and less than a year later, the Civil Rights Act of '64 was signed into law by President Johnson, followed by the Voting Rights Act of '65. He believed in tying political and social action to a set of clear, accomplishable goals that people could work on together. He disdained any diversion from political and economic goals to focus on moralism that did nothing to improve the lives of those in the margins of society. And that insight was not limited to race. In 1970, he published an important article that criticized the women's liberation movement for failing to push for wider reforms that would help poor women and black women. And he was criticized for it, being accused of male chauvinism. And he wrote the following in 1970 in an essay to respond to that charge. In the past few years, I've seen all too many of my people fall into the trap of calling any white person who disagrees with them a racist. I've always considered this practice unethical, as well as a sign of insecurity. It follows from this introduction of ad hominem attacks into political discourse that a white person cannot talk about problems affecting blacks, and vice versa. This just leads to Pittsburghers cannot talk about our problems affecting New Yorkers, and vice versa. And this will go on ad infinitum. People who engage in such attacks may want a just society, but they will build no more than a Tower of Babel. On the cusp of this election, I long for a return to a common narrative, common language, mutual respect for each other's humanity, and working toward not a vain tower in the sky of no purpose, but the concrete building of a just and peaceful world. May Rustin's words, which were directed at his own community largely, be directed to all of our communities as we work to recover the language of our past that we have grown out of the habit of using, the language that these projects involve all of us working together, each with the same language as his fellow. Shabbat Shalom.